Hi, I'm Mustell from Örebro University in Sweden. I'm working on a thesis about ball games education in PEAT, and I'm interested to follow the chain from PEAT educators to pre-service teachers and finally beginning teachers for a better understanding of how PEAT matters. Today I will present my second study where the focus is on pre-service teachers in different educational contexts. Ball games are common content in Sweden, like in many other countries, but often a part of a multi-activity and sport technique-based form that have received plenty of critique. Ball sports are prominent part of physical culture and often part of many pre-service teachers' biographies. Game-based approaches are now integrated in the ball games education of most PEAT programs. However, the provision of ball games education is affected by negotiations among different discourses. And the educational discourse, prominent in curricula and educational research, has gained importance in the ball games education in PEAT, while a health and physical activity discourse seem to affect PE practice more than PEAT. In this study we are following pre-service teachers in the transition from university courses to school placement. Previous research has stated that school placement can be an important worksite for pre-service teachers learning. However, the transition from university courses to school placement has proven to be difficult and challenging, and some reasons seem to be that learning to teach is a complex and non-linear process, and this process can look very different depending on context, pre-service teacher and pupils. Recent research that has focused on transitions in other content areas has identified that different factors enable or constrain the transition. Research regarding transitions in ball games conclude that pre-service teachers find game-based approaches compelling but difficult to implement in practice. And constraining factors identified are lack of content knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge, attitudes among cooperating teachers and pupils, and time, space and facilities. Harvey and colleagues summarizes the range of challenges facing pre-service teachers well as dilemmas at different levels. In the coming paper we want to add a Swedish perspective in what happens to pre-service teachers learning to teach ball games in the transition from university to school placement. The aim of the study is to explore the contextualization of ball games as pedagogical discourse in the transition from university to school placement. We have used Basil Bernstein's pedagogic device to understand how knowledge is produced, transformed and realized in different contexts. Ball games knowledge or meanings is initially produced in sports and research. The transformation of ball games knowledge into pedagogic discourses takes place as national agencies of education and PEAT institutions. In the study, pedagogic discourse is a key concept. A pedagogic discourse consists of an instructional discourse that always is embedded in the dominant regulative discourse. And another key concept is recontextualizing rules that regulate the transition to different contexts. Our focus in the study is on how pre-service teachers construct the pedagogic discourse of ball games, first in PEAT and then in school placement, analytic questions 1 and 2, then focus on what seemed to regulate this transition, analytic question 3. The context is the university where I'm working. The ball game education is presented on the slide, so you can see the learning outcomes of the course and the content covered in the total 67 offered teaching hours. The participants are 6 pre-service teachers, 5 male and 1 female. The data collection was done in the middle of the PEAT program after the ball games education and consisted of 3 different sources of information: text analysis of written assignments from the university course in ball games, observation of 17 lessons in school placement in upper secondary school, the 3rd out of 4 courses in school placement in the PEAT program, and finally individual interviews after the school placement course. I was of course not involved in any assessment during the course of ethical reasons. The findings are presented in 3 steps. First, out of the written assignments, 4 aspects were identified as the ball games as pedagogical discourse in the university. First, aims and goals of ball games must be communicated with the pupils. 2, the teaching of ball games needs to be adapted and modified for all pupils. 3, the teaching of ball games should involve the use of game-based approaches. And 4, the teaching of ball games should involve a technical approach. Except the last aspect, the discourse is aligned with the goals of the course and were consistent among the participants. Second, out of the observation complemented by the following interviews, we identified the following aspects regarding ball games as pedagogical discourse in school placement. Here we could see traditional ball games. In the 17 lessons observed, we could see basketball 3 lessons, volleyball and floorball 7 lessons each. 2, activity without explicit reference to curricular learning outcomes. 3, progression in 2 or 3 lessons, basic skill movements to adopted play. And 4, inclusive teaching combined with an emphasis on fun. Striking for me as an observer was that almost all lessons were carried out with a friendly and positive atmosphere, often combined with humor. Adapted drills and play form were used to include all pupils. What was more difficult for me to see was the actual learning within the games. And the finding also revealed one quite exceptional exception, where one of the pre-service teachers worked in another way, with 3 lessons in progression with clear learning outcomes relating to both curriculum and learning in games. Third, the recontextualization rules that regulate the discourse of ball games in the transition from university to school placement. We have identified 5 rules in the material. 1, knowing the pupils and the group. 2, the conceptualization of inclusive teaching. Key features of the conceptualization was a safe environment with a caring attitude and a desire to look after all pupils. The learning in relation to subject matter was less visible. The ball game 3, the ball games culture in school physical education. Most lessons were 75 minutes once a week, and at some school the supervising teachers said that they usually don't do 3 lessons of ball games in a row, and they focus more generally on health, as an example of a culture in a school. 4, expectation from pre-service teachers that ball games lesson must be fun for all pupils. And 5, the framing of ball games education in PEAT. Concepts and content from PEAT education were seen in all lessons, although not always as intended. So over to discussion and conclusions. At the university, the pre-service teachers rehearsals of the pedagogic discourse closely resemble PEAT offerings and are aligned with the educational discourse visible in Swedish curriculum and research. In school placement, the pre-service teachers' rehearsals of the pedagogic discourse emphasize inclusive teaching combined with having fun, but the object of learning is obscured. The pre-service teachers also tend to use a technical approach instead of game-based approaches. The finding of this study suggests that the regulative function of pedagogical discourse becomes more dominant in school placement. The recontextualizing rules highlight the constraints facing pre-service teachers in the transition. Not knowing the pupils or the PE culture constrains the use of what they've learned in PEAT. The conceptualization of inclusive teaching and expectation that ball game lessons must be fun tend to outweigh the need to use game-based approaches. We conclude that the knowledge of these constraints are important to consider for the ball games education in PEAT, and agree with the importance of providing pre-service teachers with to learn and understand game-based approaches more deeply, and opportunities to observe practices implemented in realistic contexts. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, please take contact.